Hello, this is Jerry Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, I would rather have a new version of universal healthcare instead of M4A, but the facts speak for themselves. And that's from Ragnar OKXG, and that looks like a tweet from R.D. Verkan, who said, my favorite fuck off moment in the new Yale study is when they showed that we could give all 1.5 million healthcare and health insurance industry workers 2 years severance pay after we pass Medicare for all, and it would literally still be cheaper than what we have now. And yeah, personally, I don't think the state should be involved in healthcare, but I think the libertarian position is, if people want to pay for their healthcare through the state, they should be able to, and if they want to pay their healthcare through private equity, they should be able to. Libertarianism is all about, you should be able to decide what you want for your body and your money. That's why it's yours. As libertarians, we tend to be very pro individual and individual autonomy. Justify doing whatever you want to with your body, your money, your house, your yard, etc., etc. So, I think, if people do want Medicare for all, they should, or universal health care, and they want to pay into it, I think that they should be able to, but I don't think people should be forced to pay into it if they don't want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, is this what Fox has become, from Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the Public Freakout subreddit. And that's Fox News host Jesse Waters. We don't need friends. If we have to, we will burn down a few bridges of Denmark to take Greenland. We're big boys. We dropped A-bombs in Japan, and now they are our ally. And yeah, I don't really care for that rhetoric, but Fox News, that they're more the exception to the rule. They're just kind of RNC propaganda, which, since Trump's currently running the RNC, it's kind of Trumpian propaganda. But, you gotta look at all the other mainstream media, legacy media now, since they're no longer mainstream in the age of social media. But you gotta look at them, and a lot of them are just DNC propaganda. But this subreddit would never call that out, since it's just Reddit as a whole is mostly just DNC propaganda. At this point, I would say, and that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have great use of tax money and regulatory catcher from nytimes.com. From Sunstone1, and that's a cross post from the sports subreddit. Dead athletes, empty stands. Why are we paying millions to keep the sport alive? And that's an article about horse racing. And yeah, personally, I don't think taxpayer dollars should be should be funding horse racing if the people don't want to fund horse racing. But that being said, I do think some animal rights activists are going too far. They recently. There's been a push to ban greyhound racing around the Western world. And now, currently, there are only two active greyhound tracks in the U.S., both in West Virginia. And I won't be surprised if horse racing was next in that regard, because the I don't think the progressives, they say we shouldn't be funding this, and I would agree with that. But then the next step, we need to, if we're not funding it, we might as well ban it. And I think that's very anti-libertarian. Banning things isn't libertarian. Libertarians believe that if something is taboo, it should be taboo among people, but that doesn't mean it should be illegal. I personally would consider myself to be against public masturbation. But if you want to justify jerking yourself off in the street in the middle of the day, that's your decision. And I personally would think that should be stigmatized. But justify doing whatever you want to with your own body. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump is plotting the biggest tax rise in global history. The burden for paying the bulk of the president's Liberation Day tariffs will fall on consumers, potentially at some $600 billion a year, from telegraph.co.uk, from CH4Locks, and yeah, this is just kind of another Orange Man Bad article that, that's very frequent when it comes to Reddit, but it doesn't really matter. I think I personally don't really care for tariffs, but Reddit only doesn't care for tariffs because the Orange Man's doing them, or they were fine with them when Biden was doing them, but when the Orange Man does them, they're the worst thing ever. It's just, as I said, I always like to say, who's in the out group, who's in the in group, and Trump's in the out group, so of course they're gonna say, oh, this is all a tax rise and it's gonna collapse our economy. But when the economy's doing shitty under Biden, they just ignored it. They redefined the definition of recession. We should have been technically in a recession during Biden's term, but they redefined the definition of it, and that's increasingly how the progressives control the narrative, because they control a lot of the news outlets, and they can redefine. They have the experts who control the dictionaries and can redefine words at their discretion. And personally, define words however you feel like. But when you're in control of the narrative, don't be surprised if people are skeptical of what you say. Then we have Mississippi governor signs bill eliminating state income tax from WAPT.com, posted by Color Monochrome, and I think that's good. I think the state should be eliminating as many taxes as possible. Mississippi isn't the richest state, but and it definitely gets a lot of negative stereotypes, I would say, since it's usually seen as poor backwater. But this is definitely something good coming out of that state, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have ICE admits to an administrative error after Maryland man sent to El Salvador prison from abcnews.go.com, posted by Paton13, and they added, "Oops, we sent an innocent man for legal claim to residence in the U.S. to a concentration camp in a foreign country. Can't bring him back now, though." And I think the issue here is, the government's so big, and they have to deport so many people. Probably most people being deported do deserve it, I would say. Even if I do think they still should be entitled to due process. But the issue here is, that when the government does something, it has to do it at a very large scale, and that usually leads to, some cases where, people who don't deserve something get it, from the government. And that just goes to show you how, when you have a big government, you have a big government is a very controlling government, and it can justify doing whatever it wants to because they ultimately have the monopoly on the use of force, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Senator Grassley plans bill to stop judges from carrying out checks and balances power from the independence.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't think that's very good. I think the government should be the branches of the government should be checking and balancing each other, but ultimately the people will justify, and if one branch decides it wants to rule over the others, it ultimately does come down to who has the force to do what, I would say, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Caught Red-Handed from Scary Ad 3516, and that's a cross-post from the powerful JRE subreddit. And that's a TikTok video, a lib's reaction after being caught vandalizing a Tesla. And yeah, I don't usually agree with too much on the subreddit, but this one I would agree with, you shouldn't be vandalizing other people's property, especially because, a lot of people are burning down Tesla dealerships or otherwise vandalizing Teslas because, the TV says Elon bad, Tesla man bad, just like it said, because, he's a member of the out-group now, because he's connected to the Orange Man, everyone knows Orange Man bad, so that just goes to show you, people will it just depends on who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group, for years, the progressives loved Elon Musk and said, Elon's saving our environment for all his electric vehicles, but now that he's joined the out-group, suddenly he's the worst thing ever, and they have to do the Tesla takedown every weekend at the Tesla dealership by my house, and that just goes to show you that, these people don't really have principles. The TV will tell them what to think, and they'll do it. If the TV said burn down your neighbor's home, they'd do it in a heartbeat, and that just goes to show you how you can't trust. You gotta critically think. You can't believe everything the TV says, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Pretty Accurate from Scary Ad 3516. And that's a crosspost from the Stupid Fucking Liberals subreddit. And that's a meme. You show me an American ghetto, I'll show you a place where Democrats are in power. And yeah, personally, you got a lot of rural podunk communities as well that Republicans are in power. So I personally wouldn't hold that too against them. But the thing is, are these poor trash ghettos because the Democrats are in power, or are they voting for the Democrats because they're poor trash ghettos? That's the thing is that the Republicans and Democrats both have tons of areas under their things that have been miserable for years. Yet people will still continue to vote for that party because the other party is seen as the worst thing ever, and that just goes to show you, you can't rely on the state to be your savior. That's what Christianity and other religions are for. You gotta have a if you want a religion to be your savior, you should have that. You can have that, but a lot of people increasingly treat politics like a religion these days and see the state as their savior. And the state isn't going to save you. Look at the inner city ghettos that voted Democrat for decades at this point, and they're still broke as shit. Or the podunk rural communities that vote Republican for decades, and they're still poor as shit. So it just goes to show you how people you can't vote your way out of poverty. You need to have personal responsibility and willingness to work up by your bootstraps. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you want to get out of poverty. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Mike Johnson on tariffs. You have to trust the president's instincts on the economy from CH4Locks, and that's crosspost from the FLMA subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really trust any politicians. But if he wants to say you have to trust the president's instincts, he should be able to say that. I personally don't trust Trump, but I didn't trust Biden either. And I don't trust Obama or Bush or anyone before them. You gotta always be skeptical of who's ever in charge, and that's I think the libertarian position, not trust whoever's in charge. Then we have Trump makes history by pardoning a corporation from thehill.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a crosspost from the DeFranco subreddit. Although the text of the pardon is not yet public, it presumably wipes out the criminal penalties against BitMEX and forgives the crimes, making it legally impossible for federal prosecutors to go after the company for any crimes falling within the scope of the pardon at any point in the future. It also changes the company's incentives for compliance with federal criminal law. And ultimately, I don't think people should be pardoning corporations, but the president can ultimately pardon whoever he wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it because the government has the monopoly on the legal use of force, and if you want to go against them, so there's nothing you can really do a lot of the time. You can peacefully protest, but as we've seen over the past couple months, that really doesn't change anything. So ultimately, it just comes down to who has the force to do what, I would say. Then we have Senators revive efforts to strip tech companies of key legal protection from thehill.com, posted by General Carlos Q17. And they said, Senators Dick Durbin, Democrat Illinois, and Lindsey Graham, Republican South Carolina, are expected to be soon introduced to the bill to sunset Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which would be one of the first bipartisan pushes in years to sunset the long-contested liability shield. Pressure is ramping up on lawmakers who failed to pass most related to technical legislation last session, despite major lobbying efforts from tech safety groups and families hoping to hold technology companies accountable for social media harms, specifically on young children. And yeah, personally, I think, it should be up to the parents should be responsible, or the parents or our caregivers should be responsible when it comes to technology. And it might be a nice thought that if you think, the social media companies should be responsible for corrupting my kid, but you should be the one controlling their internet access, not them. And it's the same thing when it comes to other stuff like firearms. If your kid kills someone with a gun that you bought them, you're not responsible. The gun company's not responsible. You're responsible for that. Well, the kid who did the shooting would be the main one responsible, but you need to take some personal responsibility as well, I would say, in that instance. I don't think the state should be charging you since you're not the one who did the shooting, but I do think you do have to take some personal responsibility as to why a kid shot at the school in the first place, if that does happen. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Target's DEI flip-flop comes at a price from phillytrib.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, fuck these spineless companies like Target, shop at Costco instead. And yeah, I have a Target down the street from me. I go there sometimes, and of course, someone like Ninja Cucker here, they're always gonna they have peak our politics brain rot at this point. They're always gonna say whatever the official DNC narrative is, pretty much. But the Philly Tribune, I think that's a black newspaper, so of course they're going to be pushing for DEI. And if Target wants to drop it, I think they should be able to. I personally don't really care if whether a company has DEI or not. I know Costco, I think, still has DEI, but it should be up to the consumers what they want to do, and the companies what they want to do. Everyone will just about to stuff. If a company wants to have DEI or division, they should be able to. If they don't want to, they should be able to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, why are so many of the other U.S. libertarian subreddits invaded by so many alt-right libertarians? Posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a self-post. They said, "Across was supposed to make here the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, and here number of you are not a libertarian comments this is starting." And yeah, libertarians do like to gatekeep, but on Reddit, pretty much 80% of all is seen as alt-right, so that's my thoughts there. If you want to call someone alt-right, you should be able to. But when you label any dissent at all as alt-right, fascist, Nazi, MAGA, etc., eventually people aren't going to take you seriously anymore. They'll just say, it's when you say everyone I disagree with is literally Hitler. Eventually Hitler doesn't have any meaning anymore. It's like the boy who cried wolf, only it's the Redditor who cried Hitler. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.